In today's tutorial, we're going to be creating this particular sci-fi loop. You don't have to use any text, but instead you could use the same concept for your own products or logos or any sci-fi shape if you please. We're going to be going step by step, and this is genuinely really easy to create. So with that, let's begin the tutorial. In our default scene, we're going to tap X to delete the default cube and add in a text object. So we'll press Shift A, search for text, and then press RX90 to rotate it on the X-axis by 90 degrees, and then press Tab to go into edit mode, and then you can type whatever text you want. So I'm going to go with CPU because I'm using the scene for a little project that I'm working on. Next, I'm going to go to my text properties down here, and I'll just increase the resolution to 64 so that it's nice and smooth, after which I'll expand the font tab and choose the font that I want by pressing this folder and going to the Windows font folder. Next, these lines are way too close to each other, so I'm going to go down to the spacing and just increase the character spacing to 1.2. Of course, you don't have to do it, it's based on your font, and I'm going to change the alignment from left to center on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, I'll keep it as is so that everything just aligns up and it's easier to place it on whatever platform we want to place it on. Next, I need to give this some thickness, so I'll go back up to the geometry tab and expand it, and this time I'll just change the extrude value to whatever thickness I feel right. So I think I'm going to go with 0.04. Next, I'll go to the material properties and add in a new material and call this text. Next, I need to create the outline for the text, so I'll press Shift D, enter, and then I'll go ahead and give it its own material. So let's press this button and call this text outline, after which I'll go to the text properties, and this time under the bevel I'll just give it a slight bevel depth, and for the fill mode I'll change it from both to none so that we get just the outline. Next, we need to place this on some sort of platform, so I'll press Shift select both of them and then GZ and move it up by just a little bit, after which I can press Shift A and search for a mesh cube, and I'll scale this down on the Z axis till it's just below the text, and then I'll scale it up on the X axis so that it covers the entire text as well. Next, I need to add in a world plane, but before that I'll just give this its own material. So let's go to the material properties, add in a new material, or for this I'll just select the default material and call this base. Then I'll press Shift A and search for a mesh plane, and I'll scale that up to a really large number. Let's go with 30, and then I'll give it its own material as well. So I'll press this new button and call this floor. Next, we need to create a few cables, so I'll just press Shift A and search for a curve Bezier, and then I'll press GZ to just bring it up by a little bit, and I'll press 7 to go into the top view, and then press RZ to just rotate it a bit, and G to just grab it back, and then I can bring it down by pressing GZ again and moving it to roughly halfway across the base plane that we have. To make this easier to see, we'll press 1 or 3 to go into the side view, and then just roughly estimate from the X-axis to the tip of this cube that we have halfway through. So I think something like that should be all right for the height. And now you can again press 7 and just give it some shape that seems like a sci-fi cable. So as long as you press 7 and go into your top view, it won't move on the Z axis, which is exactly what we want. So you can select each of these handles separately and just move them around and rotate them about to get whatever shape you want. Beyond just rotating them, you can also press E to extrude it and then rotate it as well to just get different shapes based on your preference. And once you're done with creating one of the shapes, you can just press Shift D to duplicate it and then move it to the side, and then again press Tab and rotate these about to get some other unique shape for the other side as well. If you're not in the top view, always tap the axes that you want to move it about. So in this case, I just want to move it on the X axis, and that should be all right. If you're rotating it, press R followed by the Z axis, and that'll keep it on the same plane that you're working on. So once you're happy with the placement of these curves, go to the curve properties by selecting one of them and just increasing the resolution as well, going down to the bevel tab under geometry and increasing the depth to some value that you're happy with. And in my case, I'm going to go till it becomes roughly the size of the base. So I think 0.04 is what I'm going to go with, and I'll do the exact same thing for the other Bezier curve. And in fact, you could have done this first before duplicating it so that you don't have to repeat this as many times. So I'm just going to increase the resolution, go down to the bevel and give it a depth of 0.04. I'm also going to check fill caps, although I don't want the caps to be seen within my render either way. Next, we have to give it their materials. So let's go to the material properties, add in a new material. We'll call this cable, and we'll select the other cable, Shift select the one that we just gave the material to, press Ctrl L, link materials. Next, I want just a few cables to be hanging from the top, but before I get into that, I'll place the camera so that we get an idea of the perspective. So let's select the camera, press Alt G to clear location, Alt R to clear rotation, and then we'll press RX90 to rotate it on the X axis by 90 degrees. Then we'll press GZ and just bring it up by a little bit, followed by GY to drag it back to something like this, after which you can press 0 on your numpad to go into the camera view and then continue placing the camera to the right place. So in my case, I'm going to have to press GY, bring it in, and I'll also go to the camera properties and reduce the focal length to 25 to give it a much more more wide angle perspective. Then again press GY and just move it till you get a scenario that you like. Also go to my object properties and just change the value from here as well. Maybe go with -3.5, and for the Z I want to bring it much lower. I'll just bring this down to something like 0.2. I feel like the curves are going far too away from the camera, so I'll just rotate them about the Z axis, then just place them back into position, and I think they're way too fat, so I'll go ahead and change the bevel depth as well to make them nice and thin. So I think a depth of 0.02 is good enough. So I'll do the same thing with the other cable, and I might want to change the shape of the other cable as well now. So I'll just take this and rotate it away like that, and make sure that you press the Z axis so that it doesn't move about any random axis. Then G, Shift Z or Z, and just move it away. Now that seems good enough. So let's now start adding in the cables for the top, and I also think because of that reason I'm going to reduce the scale of this base as well. So let's press SZ and bring it down by a little bit more. After which I can select all of these letters and press GZ to bring them down as well. Now let's add in these cables on top, for which I can just select these cables itself and press Shift D to duplicate them, and then rotate them on the X-axis by 90 degrees. Beyond that, I also see that this cable is coming out, so I'll press Tab to go into edit mode, and then G, Shift Z and just drag it in, so that's good enough. Next, let's select this cable, press S to scale it down, and then RZ 90, or let's go to 7 to go into my top view, G to grab it and move it, and then RZ -90, and then G and bring it till just about there, after which I can press 0 to go into my camera view, and then just grab it and move it around till I get some position that I'm happy with. I think since this is curving in this direction, I'm going to move it over to the U, and then I'll just press Shift D and duplicate it, and I'll also press Tab and change the shape of this one to be more like a cable, and then I'll press Shift D and duplicate it once again, and I think that's good enough. Then I can just duplicate these, press Shift D and move them to this side, and this time RZ 180, bring them down and change the shapes up a little bit. So you can always scale the handles as well to make them much smoother and things like that. You can also delete segments just like that so that you get only 2 control points, and you can scale those up as well. So I think I'm going to do the same thing with this. Just press X, delete vertices, and then I can take this handle and scale it up, just make it nice and droopy. So I might play around with these just before the final render, but for now this is the way. You can go ahead and add in as many cables as you want. Finally, the last thing that we have to add in as objects are just a few background elements. So I'll press Shift A, search for a mesh cube, and I'll scale it down, and then press GY to move it back away from the camera. I'll go as far back as I need, and then I'll press SZ and S and just scale them up, after which I'll press GX and move it to the side, and then I'll just press Shift D and I'll maybe scale it on the Z axis a little bit, Shift D again, maybe this one I'll scale on the X axis, so SX, and just bring it like that. And then I can just duplicate these a few times and just change the scale around by a bit, which will just give it some type of a landscape in the background, and it just adds some more visual interest to the scene. Of course, you don't need to do this, but for the particular use case that I'm going with, I require these background elements, so I'm going to go ahead and just add in quite a few of them. You don't have to worry too much about the size or anything, because again, they're just background elements, so have fun playing around with the scaling on the different axes and the different heights and things like that to get what you want. And in fact, you don't have to press Shift D, you could also press Alt D. That would save a little bit of memory if in case you're going to be adding in too many of these down the line. I don't need any materials on these background elements, so I'll just leave them as is, after which I'll select my camera, go to the viewport display and increase passport out all the way to 1. Then I'll set up the rest of the scene before we start actually giving the materials their shading and texturing. So let's switch our viewport shading to rendered so that we can actually see what we're doing. Let's go ahead and select the light from our outliner and press delete to remove it. Then let's go to our render properties, switch on bloom and screen space reflections. Then let's go to our output properties, change the frame rate to 30 frames per second. End frame can be 150 to make it a 5-second long loop. Output folder can be wherever you want it to be. File format, you can choose FFmpeg video. Encoding, you can change the container from Matroska to MPEG-4, and you can keep the output quality as perceptually lossless. Then I'll start off with the text outline material. So let's go to the materials and then bring our cursor to the junction of these two windows, click and drag to create a new window and change this from the 3D viewport to the shader editor. Next, we'll select the principled BSDF and tap X to delete it. Then I'll press Shift A and search for an emission node, and I'll plug the emission into the surface. Next, for the color, I'll go ahead and give it this lemon green color, after which I'll increase the strength to something like 20 and I'll add in a keyframe. Now the bloom seems to be an overkill already, so I'll go to my render properties, expand bloom and clamp it down at something like 4, and I'll maybe decrease the intensity to 0.02. Next, I'll switch off overlays so that no outlines or anything can be seen. Next, to actually get this strength to fluctuate, we're going to expand our timeline by a bit and change this from the timeline to the graph editor. Then in the side panel, which you can bring by tapping N in case it's not there, we're going to go to the modifiers modifiers tab and add in a noise modifier. Next, if we actually zoom out, we see that the noise is very subtle. So we're going to have to increase the strength up till it becomes fairly random. So let's increase it to something like 100. And now if you just play the animation, you ideally should have seen it fluctuate. But in case you're not seeing it fluctuate too much, that means it's way too high by itself. So with that keyframe selected, you can press GY and just bring it down, and that way you'll get far more fluctuations. So it's up to you as to how much you want this to fluctuate, but I think right now it's fluctuating a bit too much. So I can just increase the scale from 1 to something like 5 and it'll fluctuate much slower. So it's up to you as to how you want it to fluctuate. Maybe I'll go with the size of 3, and that's good enough for what I wanted to do. Next, I'm going to go ahead and work with the actual text material, which is going to be fairly simple. I'm going to leave everything as is, but I'm just going to make it metallic all the way at 1, and I'm going to keep the roughness at 0.5 itself. So that just gives slightly better reflections, and that looks good enough for what I want to do. Then for the base, I'll just select it and again make it completely metallic and reduce the roughness down to maybe 0.4. After that, since I have quite a bit of lighting added into the scene, I can go to my world properties and just change the background color to black as of now, so that I can make sure that everything is lit properly using the screen space reflections only. Next, I'll select my cables, and I'm as usual going to increase the metallic value all the way to 1. And for the actual emission, I'm gonna use a nice little technique. What I'll do is I'll take a gradient texture and make it such that it just becomes a small little patch, and then I'll use the texture coordinates to make the patch of light move along the actual cable. So for that, I'll press Shift A and search for a gradient texture initially, and then plug the color into the emission strength. Now to make sure that the emission strength can go greater than 1 as well, I'll press Shift A and search for a math node. Then I'll change this math node type from add to multiply, and multiply by a really large number. Maybe we'll go with 200 or something. You could go higher as well, and the bloom won't go too crazy because we've clamped it down. For the actual emission color, we'll go ahead and choose that same lemon green color, so that looks good enough for the time being, but we don't see any form of actual gradients occurring. So to make a gradient actually appear along the curve, we have to go ahead and press Ctrl T with the node wrangler enabled. If node wrangler is not enabled, either enable it from your edit menu and preferences over here, or just add in the mapping and texture coordinate nodes manually, after which you can switch to UV so that it goes along the body of the curve. Now we need to actually preview the gradient, so let's Ctrl Shift click the gradient texture to see it, and we can see that the gradient is going from this end of the curve towards the front like that. Now that actually looks right, so let's press Shift A and search for a color ramp node so that we get more control, and let's just plug this color ramp node in after the color, and then bring the black in, bring the white in, and then what I'll do is I'll control click to add in another stop, and then I'll control click to add in one more stop, and this time I'll change this stop value to black again. So that way we just get this small little strip. Now if you don't want to control this and make this really thin, because I don't want the line to be this long, I want it to be smaller, I could sit and make this thin like that. But another way that you can make these lines shorter is by going to the scale value over here and just increasing the scale. Even that will make them shorter as well. So it's up to you, but for now I'll keep the scale value at 5, and I'll bring this towards the sides, because that way I can just control the shape a little easier if I need to later on. To make it bright on one side, I can just bring this close and have this or so that it looks like it's a trail that's moving and stuff like that. I just get a little better control, so I'm going to actually leave it like that. And I actually like the idea of having it bright on one side and letting it fade off slowly on the other. So I'll bring this really close just like that, and I'll bring this in like that. So that way we have some area that is going to be completely white, and then we have a nice linear fall off to black. And in fact, I'm going to change this from linear to ease so that it becomes a bit softer as well. Now we can move this on the x-axis to make it go along the path of the curve, but the problem is it happens only once. So to make sure that it repeats, we can use a technique that we've used before on this channel as well, which is the use of modulo. Now we want it to repeat only on the x-axis, so I have to search for a separate xyz node so that I get control of each axis separately, and then I have to search for a combined xyz node because the input to the gradient texture is a vector. I can connect the y to the y and the z to the z, and I can just add in a math node between the x channels. Let's press Shift A and search for a math node, and this time I'll change the math from add to modulo. Now this is what's going to cause it to repeat. If I increase the number, the distance before which it repeats is going to keep increasing. If I decrease the number, it's going to get closer and closer to each other. So in my case, I'm going to go with a value of maybe 3, and that should seem good enough. So now I'll press 0 to go into my camera view, and this is what it looks like. Now I think that in the camera view, this line still seems a bit too long, so I'll go ahead and change the scale from 5 to maybe 8 or 10, and that seems better. So I'm going to leave it just like like this. Now I'll plug this color into my multiply node and then Control Shift click my principled BSDF to see what we have. Now that looks really cool. To actually make this move, all we do is move it on the x-axis location. Now that is the animation that we have, and I really think this suits for the situation that I was going for. So to actually animate this value, I'm going to expand my graph editor again and change it back to the timeline, and then on the mapping I'm going to go to frame 0 and change this x location to 0 as well, and then I'll just hover over this value and tap I. Then I'll go to frame 150 and change this x location until we get the exact same situation again. Let's zoom in quite a bit, and we need it to go to exactly there. So let's just play around with the x value until we get the next value to go into exactly there. So in this case, I think a value of 3 is getting it to the same place. I can go ahead and just maybe give it a few turns before it goes there. So I'll go with 12 and then I'll hover over it and tap I. So now if I select this node, I should be able to see the keyframes down here. So I have to press T linear to make it a nice smooth loop. And now you should be getting a seamless loop, and you should have all of these cables sending in electricity or whatever energy to your base plate as well as the text. Next, I also feel like these cable objects clearly have the edges seen. So I need to increase the bevel for the cable object. So I'll go to the object data properties or the curve properties, and under the bevel, I'll just increase the resolution to 32 so that it becomes really nice and smooth. You can clearly see the difference. So let's go ahead and do that for the other cables as well. This one, I'll just increase the resolution and it becomes nice and smooth. For these, however, I don't really need to do the same because you can't see the edge in any situation. Next, let's deal with the floor plane. So let's see how we set up this particular material. The first thing that I want is to find the principled BSDF. I'll just press period on my numpad to centralize the nodes. And now, as usual, I'm going to make it completely metallic. Next, I want to add in some bump, which is going to be a Voronoi texture. So let's press Shift A and search for a Voronoi texture. And I'll change this from Euclidean to Chebyshev. And I'll change this from F1 to F2 because this is a fairly sci-fi material. Next, I'll press Shift and search for a color ramp so that we have more control, and I'll plug the distance value into the factor of the color ramp. Now, I'll press Shift and search for a bump node to convert this into normal data, and then I'll plug the color into the height and plug the normal into the normal of the principled BSDF. Now, since we scaled the plane up by a really large number, the texture might be too small to see. So let's go ahead and increase the scale of the texture as well. And now you should be able to see the sci-fi textures starting to come in. So let's start increasing the scale. We'll go up to something like 500 maybe, and that looks pretty cool. Next, I'll just bring the black in and the white in by just a little bit to make it have more contrast, after which I'll start playing around with the emission strength. Now for the emission strength, I want to essentially use this Voronoi texture, except I want to have only a few areas light up. I'll duplicate this color ramp so that we get even more control. We'll plug the color into the factor, and then I'll press Shift A and search for a math node. Now I'll take this color and plug it into the first socket and change it from add to multiply and multiply it by a large number. So let's say 100, and plug the value into the emission strength. Next, for the emission color, I'll go ahead and give it that same lemon green color that we're using. And right now, way too much of it is lit up. Let's take this black and start dragging it in until we get just a few of these panels to light up, which looks really sci-fi and cool in my opinion. However, we face an issue, which is that as we go further and further away, all of these areas stay lit up, which doesn't really look that good. So I want these boxes that are lighting up to stop as soon as we reach this CPU logo. So for that, we can just multiply it by 0 for areas that are further away than that. So let's press Shift D on the multiply node, and this time we'll change the value from 100 to 1 initially, and we'll actually plug the socket in from a gradient texture. So let's press Shift A and search for a gradient texture, and then plug the color into the value, but we need control over the gradient texture because right now it's on generated coordinate, which goes from the absolute left side of the plane to the right side of the plane. We don't want that, so let's select it and press Ctrl T, add in the texture coordinate and mapping nodes, and this time we'll change from generated to object. And now you can see how everything towards the left of the center of this object is not lit up and everything towards the right is lit up. That's not what we want, so we'll rotate it about the z-axis by 90 degrees and we should get what we want. That way, things that are close by are lit up and things that are further away are not. Now that looks great, but we still need to add in some background to give it some more visual interest towards the top. Let's switch from the object tab to the world tab and start playing around with the world texture. Now I don't want the world to actually be giving out any light to all of these materials that we created. So I'm going to keep this as black and I'm going to add in another background node for what the camera sees. For that, let's press Shift A and search for a mix shader and plug this in over here and connect the second background into the second shader. Then for the factor, we'll use a light path node and choose is camera ray and plug that into the factor. Now for the actual color of the second background, we can go ahead and just use it a few different nodes. Let's press Shift A and search for a noise texture, and let's press Shift A and search for a wave texture. texture. Now generally the combination of this noise texture and wave texture gives a nice result that I really like, but we'll be complicating it a little bit more for this particular scenario because of the requirement that I have. Now the first thing is, obviously I don't want it to be black and white, so to change the colors I'll press shift and search for a color ramp and plug that in just before the background, and over here I'll change this white slider to that same lemon green color that we were using all along. Now if we change the scale, we do get this really cool pattern, but I still feel like it's very repetitive with it being green and black, and there's no variation in the amount of green that's added into these different layers. So to give in that variation, we'll press shift and search for a Voronoi texture and plug that in after the wave texture. So now if you look at it, you have all of these different colors of green within that single color itself. And to see this better, we can actually change the scale on all of these different nodes that we have. Let's change the scale on the noise texture down to something like 0.5 so that it's really small. But for the wave texture, I'll just go ahead and increase it to maybe 15. And then on the Voronoi texture, I'll just reduce the scale down to like 1.5. Maybe I'll change the scale on the wave texture and noise texture as well a couple of times until I get something that I am happy with. But essentially, I think I want some more variation in the colors as well. So I'll change this from F1 to F2 because F2 generally has things much rougher, and I'll change this from Euclidean to Chebyshev. Now there's a lot more detail and that looks pretty cool, but I might play around with it a little bit just before rendering. But to make sure that it loops during the animation, I'll go to frame 0, hover over the phase offset of the wave texture and tap I, and then I'll go to frame 150 and type in any even multiple of pi. So I'll just type 2 star pi so that it goes through one loop only in the entire loop, and then I'll select the nodes, come down here, press T, linear, and that way the background wave should also be moving around, and I think that just gives a nice sci-fi feel to the situation. I think that's actually all there is to do, and if you're happy with the settings and the way everything looks, you can go ahead and press render animation. Hopefully you enjoyed this one, and you can use this technique to create really cool sci-fi animations with different objects as the main focus and just go crazy with creativity. If you like this one, definitely check out other videos on my channel. It would really help me out a lot, and I'm sure there's something or the other for you to learn in my videos. Until the next video comes out, thank you so much for watching. Keep creating and stay creative.